here at the Belfer Room here at Center for here at the Fairbanks Center. My name is Mark Wu. I am the director of the Fairbanks Center, and it's my pleasure today to kick off the April portion of our critical issues series with a real lively conversation featuring two preeminent thinkers in international relations speaking on U.S.-China competition in the coming decade. I don't think I need to go into any great detail why the future of this question is of critical interest, not only to those of us who care about international affairs or international relations, but pretty much for anything on this planet. The nature of how this competition unfolds is going to be absolutely critical. And so without further ado, let me introduce our speaker and our moderator today. Our speaker today is Professor Xuetong, who is the distinguished professor and the dean for the Institute of International Relations at Tsinghua University. He is also the vice chair of the China Association of International Relations and the China Association of American Studies, among the various other roles that he holds. He has been named by Foreign Policy Magazine as one of the top 100 thinkers in the world on this issue. And of course, many of you know that he is affiliated with what we might describe here as the moral realism school, or the Qianxia, or the Chinese historical determinist viewpoint of international relations. So it will be a real treat for all of us to hear his reflections since the last 3 years, what's unfolded since he was last here at Harvard, and his views of the U.S.-China competition in the years to come. We're honored and privileged also to be joined as the moderator for today's discussion and the discussant, Professor Stephen Walt. Professor Walt, as I think also need to know introduction in this room, but I will just quickly do so. He is the Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he is also the faculty chair of the Belfer Center's International Security Program. And as many of you know, he is one of the leading thinkers affiliated with the Realism School of International Affairs and one of the top thinkers thinking about U.S.-protected international relations. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say we have two of the world's most preeminent thinkers on international affairs to talk about the most important topic in international affairs. And so without further ado, let's extend a warm round of applause to Professor Yan and to Professor Walt. Professor Yan, over to you.
Okay. So what's the format? How long for this presentation?
If you don't mind speaking here, 20-25
minutes. Okay.
Then
okay. Thank you, Dr. Wu, for arranging this very valuable opportunity for me to share my view and with all of these distinguished guests. And also, I highly appreciate your requirements and invited Stephen Walt, my academic brother, to make a comments about my presentation. Since we are all realists, I doubt we have any difference between us, but I don't know. I just want to share from the very beginning, because just I visited the library. They want me to get the conclusion first before illustrate my arguments. So I will tell you, my argument is very realistic, and the confrontation between China and the US will getting worse. And this competition between these two powers and will shape the coming order. That's a basic argument. But this order will be different from Cold War. It won't be a new Cold War. So I will start to explain why it won't be a new Cold War. I think that there's a very serious debate about what kind of a global order we're going to have. Some people said that we're come to a new Cold War or second Cold War or Cold War II. But then the other group people said we definitely know that in the new bipolarity, the confrontation between China and the US will getting worse. But this time the competition is different. And from that between US and the Soviet Union, not only in degree, it's different in character. And it's not only in degree, it's different in character. And first, someone argued that if we have World War I and World War II, so why we won't have a Cold War I, Cold War II? I think there's a misunderstanding about the criteria for us to judge the character of international order or global order. World War I and World War II share a very fundamental character for that global order. That means the war simultaneously happened in many countries during the Cold War. And it's no longer that case, right? So this is very different. We have a lot of proxy wars during the Cold War, but not a war simultaneously happening in many countries. That's why we think it is a Cold War, it's not a hard war, it's not World War III. But then the question comes, is a proxy war definitely means a Cold War? Okay, how could, no, if the war between two countries, but not the war simultaneously happen in many countries, will be Cold War? That is my understanding. That's a misunderstanding the nature or character of the Cold War. And before the World War II, we have 22 years of peace. But at that time, there's a war. The war between the Russia and the Poland, the Egypt War, the Indian War, and the Japanese invasion of the China. But no one regarded that as a Cold War. Why they do not regard the period between World War I and World War II as a Cold War? And also the period before the World War I, there's a, generally speaking, we call it 100 years peace. But at that time, we have war between the Japan and the Russia. We have war in a Boer War in South Africa, and we have opium. Saying why people do not call that period as a Cold War? Because the Cold War has a very special character. The competition between two superpowers driven by ideological expansion rather than for other purpose. The purpose of the two superpowers try to expand their political system or the social model and the ideology to other countries that they compete for see who have more followers with the same political system inconsistent with themselves. So capitalism and communism. So this is the core, it's a content of this, the nature of the Cold War. And so the form of this competition represented by what? By proxy war. No direct war between nuclear powers. So now we can come to discuss about the situation today and the possible scenario in next 10 years. We will have this competition between China and the US driven by ideology or something else. My understanding, neither China nor US have the intention to expand their ideology or political model. For the American side, very recently, Campbell said that US should give up this idea to change China. You can never change a country like China with the 1,000 years of history, especially with the Confucianism. Chinese may wear jeans, eat out of McDonald's, but they won't have an American ideology. You cannot change them. And meanwhile, and for American government, even for Biden administration, they just concerned how to protect the so-called democracy or liberalism where in democracies, not expand them to the others. The reason is very clear. The Western democracy are not challenged by socialism or communism or anything else, but populism. Populism is gaining momentum, not only in the Western countries, but also in non-Western countries. It becomes a kind of a global ideology. And populism strongly challenges the dominating influence of liberalism. So Western democracy is undermined not by socialism or communism, but by populism. In this country, people and that typical period, and possible that period will come back again. And so now we understand that China certainly, on the one hand, Chinese government has already said that we are not unhappy with the current existing order. And we think we should make the order less dominated by the US and make the order of more fair. But meanwhile, Chinese government said, I have no intention to impose my model, my approach, my political system onto other countries. So first is they said, well, we have no will. Second, object, I don't think China has that resources and the capability to make Chinese model and so influential in the world. Because we clearly define the Chinese model like what? The model with the Chinese characteristics. Can we make any country's development or their political system with a Chinese characteristic? It's impossible. For China, we understand we cannot, if the people do not speak Chinese, the people do not have to live grown up with the Chinese culture, how can you make their country's political system with the Chinese characteristic? That's impossible. This is a cultural characteristic. Second, and China also define that all of our success based on what? Based on the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Can we establish the Chinese Communist parties in foreign countries? That's impossible. You can make some country have a communist party, but you cannot make that country's communist party become the Chinese Communist Party. Without the base, how can you make the Chinese model with the Chinese characteristic to prevail in all of the other countries? That's impossible. So from my understanding, now the competition between China and the US is not driven by ideological expansion. Neither side want to do it. Why? Why neither the US and China, means these rational policymakers, not these some politicians, and they first the executive branch in this country and headed by a Biden administration clearly announced that US do not want to go to war, to have a new Cold War. At least the White House said that they don't want to have a Cold War. Chinese government also clearly stated, we don't want to have a Cold War. Certainly, maybe some congressman said, hey, why not? And since the US win the Cold War, and we have the superiority to win that kind of a competition, a rivalry, why we make another Cold War then? We have a more chance to win it, right? So we can win the last one, then if we make a new Cold War, so we can win it again. We just repeat the history. Well, it's so clear. For China, understand that if we are going to fall into a new Cold War, we have a less chance to win. Why we want to go to a new Cold War and which we have less chance to win? And so here it comes clear, and China's. So firstly, is that is an interest concern. Second, both China and the US must concern. Hey, the age has already different. It's not the traditional environment. In the last 1,000 years, all major powers compete in where? In the natural space, including the Star War in late 1980s. The Star War also in the natural space. This space is created by what? By nature. If you have religion, you may believe created by God, not by human being. Then today, human being create a new space for major powers to compete against each other. It's a cyberspace. So China and US must compete with each other simultaneously in two spaces. And so both sides understand that. Any side adopt the traditional strategy used by the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War cannot win this competition because these strategies, no matter the successful one or failure one, and not suitable for today, for competition in two spaces. And the war in the Ukraine clearly illustrates this argument. So the Union have a superiority, military superiority in natural space. But in cyberspace, there are disadvantages to NATO. NATO has a superiority in the cyberspace. That's why, and so the Russians' military superiority in NATO space cannot achieve the goal they designed. Okay, both China and the US understand that we are competing in the digital age, and obtaining the superiority in the cyberspace is more crucial than the NATO space. So Biden administration adopted a very, very important and strategy, very different from the American government did during Cold War. Small yard, high fence. What means small yard, high fence? It means users united with those countries with a high digital technology. And exclude China from this kind of international cooperation. As long as China cannot continue the international cooperation with high digital technology countries, and the US will have more chance to keep the power gap between China and the US, possibly can enlarge the gap. So that's why the Biden administration clearly said that now these are our strategy, is no doubt. And then for China, it's also very clear. And Chinese government also know the main area for competition is the cyberspace, not the natural space, not the natural resources, not the territory, not the land and sea, but then the digital technology in cyberspace. Then what? China adopted the strategy, so-called dual circulation strategy. Internal circulation and external circulation, but based on the internal circulation is a core. What do you mean internal circulation? That since the American adopted the high fence, small yard high fence strategy, and we have a less opportunity to cooperate with these high-tech countries, that will have to rely on self-independent digital research. But meanwhile, they find, hey, digital technology is different from the previous technology we know. And it requires international cooperation. So very recently, I think last month, the Politburo meeting and clearly stated, we have to open national technology research plan to the international community. We understand that without international cooperation in technology research, we have no chance to continue narrow the power gap within the United States. So you see, nowadays when people both sides understand that the competition is in the cyberspace, the core of the competition is a digital technology superiority, then the ideological confrontation is just instrumental, used for that purpose. The ideology is no longer the goal. It's not the purpose for the strategy. It's used for serving to achieve the goal. That means technology superiority and for winning this competition. So I think I have 5 minutes, right? And the last 5 minutes, I want to talk something quite theoretical. And the current situation, I mean the existing order and the coming order, it's not the Cold War because it's a basic feature. It's not a geopolitical competition. It's a cyber political competition. And that is represented by what? By counter-globalization. Globalization started from the end of the Cold War. Globalization represented the order for the last 30 years, post-Cold War period. And that's the major feature of that global order. And now global order is replaced by the counter-globalization. And the counter-globalization becomes the main feature of the existing order. That's my view. I don't know whether how many people agree with me, but I think it will maintain as a main feature of the global order in next decade. Where do the counter-globalization come from? It stems from the globalization. Globalization makes the social polarization worse and worse. We are so proud, including China and the US. We're proud of that G20 owns more than 85% of the GDP of the world. Wait a minute, G20 only represents 40 countries. Probably the other 150 countries, they only share that slice a piece of a pie, 15% of the global GDP. At an international level, the polarization becomes worse and worse. Domestically, I think both American and Chinese, you can see the social polarization becomes so horrible. The rich people, this country has the most rich people in the world, that's true. And just because we have the most richest people in the world, then what? The social polarization becomes the worst, the worstest in the world. The more you benefit from globalization, the social polarization becomes worse. And so this kind of a polarization definitely makes the people in the class, including middle class, unhappy with the government. Unfortunately, we're realists, and maybe I should not use the term unfortunately, and because of this, and then liberalism or liberalist elite becomes a target of the people resent the globalization. They think of all these things, polarization, because of the idea of liberalism. They gave the big international corporation more chance to accumulate the wealth, and one company owns the wealth, and could be more than 10 or 20 countries. And we have a thorny horse, right? This 独角兽, thorny horse, and a few young people, and just a few, they can accumulate wealth over $1 billion within 3 or 5 years. So how about the ordinary people? They say it's true. Globalization improves the ordinary people's life, but my wealth only improve from 1,000 mans to 3,000 mans. Look at these rich people. They're from the a billion to from a million to a billion. So the relative gap enlarged so fast. And there's a very typical Chinese view. And for Confucianism, we said that a human being has a nature. They never hate, they never dislike poverty, but they really dislike inequality. That means if I'm poor, it's okay, but as long as you're as poor as me, if you're richer than me, I cannot accept it. No matter how rich I am, I cannot accept you are richer than me. So this kind of human nature make this resentment against liberalism and the liberalist government and that kind of a free trade and market economy, and people dislike. So the populism populism as an ideology becomes quite prevailing, not only in the West democracies and non-democracies the same. What happened? Actually, ideology is not that threatening. But when one ideology controls the power, it will change the society. It will change the government policy. Then what's the policy? When populist leaders, and based on the populist ideology hold the power, they adopted a deglobalization policy. Anti-globalization, that's my definition, means the people in the grass dislike the negative impact of globalization, but they have no power. They cannot stop globalization. So you see the anti-globalization occupy the Washington Street and happen, then what? They cannot stop the globalization. But when the government started using their sovereignty, their political power to adopt a deglobalization policy, they can stop globalization. They can make a counter-globalization becomes a main trend. So today you find that the populism is already gaining power in many countries. And that as long as if I use 1 minute, I think my time is running out. And there's a typical case. That's my view. The populist ideology is economic security. The term economic security adopted by every major powers, national documents. All of them, all of us. Wait a minute. Can any of you give me a definition? What is economic security? What is the scope of economic security? What's the border of economic security? What's the limit of economic security? No one knows. But the concept of economic security legitimized all kinds of deglobalization policy for the sake of economic security. So we should shorten supply chains, or we should totally reduce supply chains, and we should have our own domestic supply chains for the sake of economic security. So if the concept of economic security legitimize the policy, any policy, stop international economic cooperation. For instance, you can argue that, hey, wait a minute, there's a McDonald's in my city. So you make the local restaurants lost their customer. That's the economic security issue, right? That's McDonald's is an American company. In any country, we regard it as an American company. They make the money from America, and then they say, hey, wait a minute, McDonald's take away our customers. That's the economic security issue. So because the term economic security is so weak, no one knows what it is. So it legitimizes any policy which rejected the international cooperation. Finally, I would say, where do this economic security concept come from? Xenophobias. And populism in every country, they attribute all failure, all deception to what? To foreign actors, to foreign factors, to foreign elements. Anything foreign can pose a threat to this country. Foreign immigrants, foreign technology, foreign company, and a foreign investment, everything can be regarded as the kind of threat to the country's to a country's economic security. So finally, I would say now we really should be seriously considering how can reconsidering about these issues of global orders from the realist perspective means how to defend our national interests. And if you want to have absolute security, you want no car accident, the only way is stop producing car and flying. If you want to avoid air crash, don't produce airplanes and no air flight service, then you have absolute security. So realists never run for absolute security. It's only run for relative security. So finally, I would say, and because this time China and US compete in the digital age, and mainly the competition in the cyberspace determines the victory or loser. And so both China and the US will adopt different strategies from the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War period. So that's why we won't turn back to, we won't have the second Cold War. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to comment on Xuetong's remarks. And I want to say at the outset that we are violating a sacred Harvard rule here, in that we actually have two realists in the room. And not only two realists, but we really have three, because I see Bob Ross over there and I could enlist him in that. But also, as some of you may not know, we share the same dissertation chairman, Ken Wallace, at University of California, Berkeley. Despite that common heritage, I'm going to try to find a few things to disagree with, even though much of what I just heard that I do agree with. I agree, for example, that calling this a new Cold War is a bad framing. It's a convenient analogy, a convenient phrase, but I don't think it fits for the reasons he laid out. A better one would be great power competition, which of course is what happened before World War II and before World War I, and for many centuries before that as well. So I don't think we're going to have a Cold War like the one we lived through with the Soviet Union. And I think he's right. The competition will be different in character, but that doesn't mean it won't be incredibly intense as well. I will disagree a little bit in a moment with whether or not there's an ideological dimension to this or not. I think, in fact, there is, and that will make it somewhat worse. But I agree that we're going to have a rivalry here. We're going to be competing in a number of realms, including the cyber realm. That's a very important aspect of this. And this will be happening in a period where the world is retreating to some degree, but not completely, from the degree of hyper-globalization that we had in the 90s and the aughts as well. I think that's all true. What he didn't answer, and it's the one question I ask, is this not new Cold War more dangerous or less dangerous than the Cold War that we went through? It seems to me, the most important question that we have to wrestle with. And let me make a few comments about that. I mean, first, this is, I think, a rivalry rooted in structure. This is where the realists come out. The two most powerful countries in the world are inevitably going to eye each other warily and worry about what the other might do. That doesn't necessarily make war inevitable, but it means that the competition between them is going to be a serious competition. This will not be like two friends who like to go out and play tennis once a week, and they play really intensely, and then they get together and have a beer afterwards. It's not going to be that kind of competition. It's going to be a very serious, very intense one where neither side wants to lose, where both sides would prefer to be the stronger, would prefer to have more friends, more allies, superiority in technology, superiority in military capacity, etc. Both sides would prefer to be number one. Yeah. Right. And as I sometimes tell my students, no American president ever runs for office saying, my goal is to make America number two. Right. And I think that's now increasingly true in the Chinese Communist Party as well, in its own way. Second, and here's a slight disagreement, there are competing worldviews here. It's not the same as, say, Marxism, Leninism as an export commodity as it was during the Cold War. But the United States is defending not just a rules-based order, but a liberal rules-based order, which we would like to have as a global order, right? China also has notions about what the world order should be, but it's not a liberal world order. It's in some respects a much more Westphalian world order, hard shell sovereignty. Each country gets to decide, for example, what the definition of human rights is, as opposed to a more universalist conception, which I think is true in the United States. And this ideological dimension is, of course, very obvious in the case of American foreign policy, where the Biden administration likes to frame it as democracy versus autocracy. That is an ideological distinction. And we just held our second democracy summit, suggesting that this is not absent in the way in which they're approaching foreign policy as well. So there's going to be a rivalry. It's going to be a significant one. It won't just be a friendly competition. Now, that said, overt violent conflict, a real clash of arms, is not inevitable. That might be one similarity, we hope, with the former Cold War. And I think we ought to recognize something that I also agree with, that if you step back for a second, these countries are going to be rivals, but they may not, in fact, be existential threats to one another, except in the most extreme circumstances. The United States is a very large country with millions of people in it, a very large and productive economy, thousands of nuclear weapons, and a very powerful military. China is a large country with a growing economy, 1 billion people, and they're separated by this vast ocean. The Chinese are not going to sail across the Pacific, land at Seattle, and march across the country and impose Chinese Communist Party rule on the United States. And the United States is not going to sail across the Pacific or leave bases in Japan, land at Shanghai, and drive towards Beijing. Neither. Moreover, I don't think the Chinese model is ever going to take hold in the United States. And I think I will end my life without liberal multi-party democracy arising in China. So in a sense, the two states are not existential threats to one another. And I'm not even mentioning the fact that both sides have nuclear weapons and China is going to have more of them in the future, which also puts a limit on what the other could promise to do to the other. They will compete for power and influence and superiority, but both sides need to step back occasionally and say that there are just limits to what they could purport to do to the other. So what worries me? So what worries me are situations where, first of all, one side or the other is optimistic in the short term, but starts to be pessimistic in the long term, who believes that they have opportunities to make real gains now, but if they wait, they might lose those opportunities. Classic preventive war type thinking. That worries me. I worry about the actions of third parties in different parts of the world as well. I worry especially today about the gradual severing of communication between the two societies, where each side increasingly is trapped in its own bubble, where it tells itself a story about its role in the world and what it's doing, but it never listens or talks to the other side, or at least not as extensively as we once did. And in those circumstances, and this can happen in both countries, you essentially get nationalist outbidding, where politicians and intellectuals start to compete for who can be more anti-American or who can be more anti-Chinese. I think one can see those dynamics already happening in both places. And then finally, what really worries me is that I don't see a serious effort underway at present to develop ways to manage this particular relationship as well, with either the United States putting some real meat on the bones of saying that they want to cooperate where possible, compete where necessary. I don't see that being manifested in policy initiatives, but I also don't see anything coming out of Beijing in the same direction as well. As some of you know, my colleague Danny Roderick and I wrote a paper last year trying to lay out a framework, a very general framework for how the two states might begin to try and build that kind of cooperative framework by identifying actions each would agree not to undertake towards the other. For example, not trying to overthrow each other's governments, not engaging in beggar thy neighbor trade policies, etc. There would be a second category where each side would agree to adjust its behavior in exchange for concessions by the other. So trade negotiations are a classic illustration of that. Arms control would be another example where we are willing to make concessions to you if you're willing to make certain concessions to us. And there may be some areas where we can proceed on that basis. And then finally, recognizing that there are going to be areas where each side is going to act independently, but with a norm established that the independent actions that each side undertakes to defend its own interests would not be escalatory in nature. They would be well calibrated to address the problem that's being posed by the other's actions, but not as an effort to try and gain unilateral advantage. And what we think is the beauty of this framework is you don't have to decide in advance what issues go in which box. We first establish the framework and then begin saying which issues you might want to put in each box as well. Now, I'm not saying that would necessarily answer the problem, but that would at least be an approach that the United States and China could begin to adopt to try and move towards a more constructive set of arrangements to manage what is ultimately going to be a deeply competitive relationship. Let me stop there and just reiterate my question. If it's not a new Cold War, is it better or worse?
Okay, very good question. I think I want to make a three response to the comment. May I borrow a piece of paper? And okay, and first, I think this is a very good question. And for a scientific study of the IR, you cannot only tell the direction of the world or the global order, but you also have to tell how far the will go and how long it will last, right? Both you have to study and the time span and also the degree and how much the retrogress will make. And generally speaking, I think I would prefer to use the term uneasy peace to describe the order instead of anything, any description plus war. Why is peace is war? Because of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons plays the function prevent the war between the US and the Soviet Union during Cold War. It will continue to function and on the relationship among the major powers. The war in Ukraine has lasted for over a year. And Russia has threatened or gave a kind of hint that he may use nuclear weapons. But now all of the people understand that, and Russia will not use it until there's something happened domestically rather than on the battleground. So what I mean, it means that I think we'd better use a peace to describe the current order and instead of war. Firstly, because a nuclear weapon will prevent the direct war between China and US. Second, and I don't think China will fall into proxy war like the Russia in Ukraine. And the reason is very simple, and no one in China see, and any proxy war can help China to improve our digital technology invention. No, anyone make the argument proxy war will help China to obtain the technology superiority over the United States. It won't have that kind of function. So for China, still concerned that all of our achievements made in the last 40 years is based on we do not involve the war after the war in 1979, the Vietnam War. And so peace is more favorable for China to narrow the gap with the US rather than to the United States, at least at American side. A lot of congressmen still concerned the war is the most effective instrument for US to win the competition rather than to peace. Then that's why I use the term uneasy. You say how far it go? I say that there's no direct war between China and US, and there's very slight chance to see a proxy war between China and US. But the uneasy parts will become worse and worse. So I highly agree with Steve's worriness about the three worrying. The tension, the competition between China and the US will be intensified, cannot be released. So if I want to make an analogy to illustrate my prediction about this, the nature of the global order or the competition between China and US, I will say the competition between China and the US will be a football. There's a lot of violations, but not a boxing match. They do not knock each other down, to not change the other's regime, to not change that country. And it's not a boxing match, it's a football game. So there's a violation inevitably, and a lot of clashes may happen. And the second question is order. I think first I want to make a distinction between the global order and the type of global order. I think both China and the US share this view. We want to maintain the global order. Order means it's major powers to settle down their disputes and through peaceful, diplomatic, at least any methods, but not war. They settle down their conflicts and through any methods, maybe very unpleasant, very brutal, but not war. And that is order. But then there are differences between what type of order. Like Professor Walt said that China prefer a type of order. It's not what American like. But I'm not so sure America want to resume the labor order. I will say maybe Biden administration. I doubt the congressman like that. I doubt the American congressman want to resume that labor order. They may not. They want to have a Cold War instead of the labor order. And so that's the difference. And what type of order we want to have? That means rhetorically, China said, we do not like the term of the order based on rules. It's based on your rules. I do not like the order based on your rules. I want to have an order based on the common rules. The rules are shared by everyone. So I think is that. So then this is debatable. And some people said, hey, we need an order. I think this doesn't make sense. And university is a kind of an order. Prison is a kind of an order. Market is a kind of an order. Then it doesn't mean that you have the strict order is good order. Prison's order is the most stable. No one like it. And the university is a kind of order and with a much more freedom. People like this kind of order. So I think this is really debatable between China and the US and what type of order should be or desirable for the world. That's it. The third question is about the nationalism. I totally agree with Steve's argument. Even there's no ideological differences. Nationalism also can bring war to the human being. Before the World War I, right? The same ideology, or imperialism, they fight against each other. So nationalism itself bring the major power into war, not because the difference between their ideology, because of the same ideology, right? So here I would argue the radical nationalism is really already becomes a very obvious on the internet. And the internet and the netizens are very, very radical, and they do play a very, very negative role on the bilateral relationship, on the competition between China and the US. But I doubt they really have, they can decide a policy. To make the decision go to war, and my understanding, and actually is decided by the leadership. Certainly, the public opinion may have some influence on them, but in most cases, public opinion is just an excuse used by leadership. And the leaders, when they want to go to war, they say, look at that. And all of the majority of people want to have the war, they do it. But when they do not want to go to war, they can just pretend didn't realize that kind of a public opinion. So through this discussion, and some people ask me, how about the think tank? Well, I'm really do not give a very high value about think tank. I doubt think tank has an impact on the final policy making. And the table case in Trump administration period. And I don't think a think tank have a strong impact on the policy makings in any major powers today, right? But the people working in think tank, suppose they are very influential. So personally, I will argue that the order of the coming decade is mainly depends on the leaders of the major power. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that's a source of optimism or pessimism. I could tell that either way. In terms of the marching orders here, are we going to open this up?
Mark, are you?
Mark, yeah. Okay. So at this point, the floor is open for questions. Please make it a question and identify yourself before you ask it. Bob.
So if there were three realists in the room, we only proved that there is no one building stack. Yes, I will, yes. So I agree with that American ideological diplomacy is instrumental. And I agree with that China has benefited from peace and stability. And so continues to promote peace and stability, not because it's a better country or loves peace, because continued rise is in China's interest, and you have done so through stability. But at the same time, I think we're missing the American component in leadership. And this leadership is not interested in competing, it's interested in superiority. And it's clear from the White House report of China, it's clear from Catherine Tai said, it's clear from what Jake Sullivan has said, it's about superiority. And so this is a classic competition where the driver of conflict is the declining power that seeks to retain provided. Now, we see that in Asia, which brings me to my question. The US is leaning very heavily, the Philippines, leaning very heavily on South Korea. And China is leaning very heavily on both as well. So America believes the alignment of these countries and our presence in these countries is vital for American security. It's so much different than what you said, where it's no longer geopolitics, it's on cyber. So it seems to me that cyber is the underlying strength that contributes to military capability and enable the United States to preserve a balance of power in East Asia. We're still competing over the same area, but cyber is now a fundamental source of competitive capabilities rather than the engine itself. I don't know if you could talk about that.
Okay. Well, first the question is about the American, how do American view the American superiority over China? I think one thing is clear. And in this country, and also in many countries, believe America have ideological superiority over China. And the Chinese official ideology not that popular, not as that popular as Americans' ideology. America has a lot of allies share the same ideology. China has no allies and with a shared ideology, right? And even China and Vietnam and even will all under the communist rule. And I doubt China and Vietnam will regard it as a well ideological partnership, right? So that's true. And I think this is also a kind of it's a very important fact, can explain why a lot of congressmen prefer the Cold War. Because they said, since America have the superiority over the US in terms of ideology, why we do not launch the ideological confrontation against China? Because we have superiority, we have more chance to win the competition. Second, because the US have the superiority in this domain. So if we have the Cold War, we have more chance to win it and win the competition quickly. So that's why, from my understanding, in this country, and the liberal order seems to me is no longer dominating, and the Cold War mentality has already becomes a dominating ideology in this country. How China responds to this? I think China, I would suggest Chinese government should be very wise to understand this. Just because America have the ideological superiority, we should avoid this kind of competition with the US as much as possible. And if we can successfully avoid this, and we do not tangle with the US, let American to do it by itself. Without a partner, you cannot have a tangle, right? Like that. The second question about the geopolitical issues. My understanding, geopolitical thinking is not only dominating in this country, also in China. Many Chinese, including a lot of Chinese strategies, they still look at this world and from the geopolitical perspective, instead of a cyber politics perspective. I'm minority in China, Bob knows that, and where people share my view, they think geopolitical analysis makes sense more than my argument. So unfortunately, I think those people with the geopolitical thinking ignore one thing. The competition in the cyberspace are not geopolitical. You cannot find the regions in the cyberspace. In makerspace, there's a regions, but in the cyberspace, there's no regions. There's a domains, economy, technology, ideology, and security, military, but there are no regions because the internet is global. Even China established the firewall, still you cannot have a totally, absolutely independent internet. The internet always connected with each other as a global system. So in that way, I will say, and the geopolitical thinking is not healthy for preventing Cold War, but then gradually, I think the geopolitical thinking also will meet a lot of failure. I mean, in terms of explaining the reality. And the geopolitical analysis cannot explain a lot of new events and not new phenomena. And the geopolitical thinking and it's already that's my view, it's already out of date. If not absolutely out of date, but at least it's already not inconsistent with reality in some degree.
Is that a hand I saw up there? Yes.
Thank you. Klaus Lares, I'm a visiting scholar here. Thank you for your talk and nice to see you again. I think we last week saw each other in Qinghua in 2019. A quick question about Europe. How would you see Europe in that great power competition? The Chinese, as you know, have been trying to lure Europe away from the United States for many years, particularly the Southern Europeans, but also Germany to some extent. Is that going to continue? Will it succeed?
Well, okay, this is this question directly related to the judgment about the international configuration, whether it's a multipolar or it's a bipolar or it's a unipolar, right? And actually, I think this is very strange. When Japan's GDP accounts for 2/3 of the U.S. in 1980s, anyone regarded it as a multipolar. Soviet Union, US, Japan, why they regarded it as a bipolar instead of the multipolar. After the Cold War, and when EU established, and EU is a big economy, and actually the size is larger than the US, but people still regard it as the unipolar system dominated by the United States, and rather regard it as the EU, as a polar. So they never regarded after the Cold War is a multipolar or bipolar. Today, a lot of people use the EU and consider the EU as a polar. So they argue now the current existing and global configuration is a multipolar because the EU has a similar size of the GDP as the US and China. Then the question is why, before no one taking into the account of the EU's influence in the world. So that's my view. I think maybe we influenced by wars. We think the polar should be defined by nation rather than by international organization. And if we define the polar as by international organization, the largest player is UN. United States is the largest polar, and they take 100% the GDP. It doesn't make sense. The EU by now, my understanding, is still an international organization instead of a nation. So my understanding, EU's policy and try to follow a kind of strategy initiated by the Singapore is called the hedging strategy, and between China and US. But after the war occurred in the Ukraine, and EU found that they had to side with the US more than to maintain this balance between China and the US, because they need the US help to fight the war in the Ukraine. So what's the EU's role? I think the EU do have a strong impact on the coming global order. That depends on how do they use their power to maintain what a kind of balance between China and the US. If they totally side with the US, and the configuration and will change a lot. And if they totally side with China, also make the bipolar is more solid. So now I think EU still hesitates and what kind of role they can play. For instance, and EU has already by the end of last year, they already decided to develop their EU intra supply chains, food, pharmacy, and digital technology, and energy, and I forget the face and material, something like that. So they said we can't rely on neither China nor the US. And so they also consider that have become as an independent power. But I'm not so sure whether they can achieve that goal or not. So EU seems to be their struggle with themselves.
Gentleman in the back.
I'm Shadi, I'm from Egypt. First of all, I must say that China has always been a great partner to the Middle Eastern countries and has always been received very well. And it sided a lot with its major issues like the Israeli-Arab conflict, and economically it supported it. So, I mean, the relations, the Middle Eastern relations with China have always been really good. But unfortunately, with the recent expansion that's happening in the Middle East, we can see more tendency of encouraging the autocrats and giving them free hand to do whatever they want in the Middle Eastern countries. And we saw that with the recent visit to Saudi Arabia by President Xi and the first thing that he said is that we will not interfere in your domestic politics. So it's, I mean, if you're not happy with the Americans promoting the liberal order, but this is essentially promoting autocrats and promoting authoritarianism. So now I think that China is even promoting authoritarianism more than the Americans are promoting liberal. So, and again, going to your comment about that this is not your order. I think that the order is based on the Universal, on the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And I think that we should all abide by. And here, what do you think of abiding by this Declaration of Human Rights to all countries as the basis of of fair competition, of competition between great powers? Why don't we use this instead of going to the pre-world wars by saying that the leaders are the ones who will decide how to balance things? We should have the order. If you have any alternative to this world order of abiding by the universal, the Declaration of Human Rights, please tell us.
Okay. Well, my understanding, according to the Human Rights Charter of the UN, and the government, every country's government is the first the responsibility actor, not other countries. I don't think we can attribute any awful human records in any country to foreign powers. So just like that, you say, okay, I cannot make my family and very benign, very harmonious and inconsistent with the human rights in my family, because my neighbor is wrong, because my neighbor never come to control my family, right? So my understanding, the major powers do have some influence on other countries' politics, but they don't have this responsibility to decide what kind of regimes or political systems, ideology that country should and have. So that's China's official stance. And China do not want to impose any ideology or the political system on any country. Maybe we don't, even we know the authoritarian regime is not good. So here come to the Middle East. And first we have to ask why these governments, Middle East countries, do not implement the UN Charter of the Human Rights. Second, why the Middle East countries, including Egypt, why do Egypt to undertake the responsibility to correct this authoritarian regime in the other countries? And Egypt is a major power of the Middle East, but I doubt Egypt will undertake the responsibility for the human rights issue in Saudi Arabia. And the same, I think we cannot expect the foreign powers and to take a responsibility for any country's domestic human rights issues. That's it.
Yes, the woman right there.
Thank you, Professor Young, for speaking. My name is Margaret. I'm from the school. Specifically in your book, you mentioned neither the US nor China is able to provide a global leadership in the next decade.
Yes.
What does it look like to have humane authority leadership in cyberspace competition for both powers? Is that even possible? It doesn't sound optimistic right now. Thank you.
Well, I think in next decade, neither China and the US can provide a global leadership by itself. And Clinton did during the post-Cold War period. And maybe the Bush and Junior Bush. But now US no longer have that kind of resources and capability, unilaterally provide a global leadership. And if US do not have that capability, China is secondary to the US, China certainly do not have the resources and the capability to do it. And so in next decade, very possibly we will witness that there's no global leadership. And the other reason is that China and the US cannot jointly provide leadership like the France and the Germany for EU. And that requires a special condition. So at this moment, we cannot see any chance like that. And so it's possible. We will see, and there's a lot of like I argued in my book, and the regional powers and provide a kind of, they will compete for regional leadership instead of provide a collective leadership. So that's why we think, and the coming order is less stable, more chaotic than the post-Cold War order. And that means counter-globalization will be less stable, more conflict than globalization. Globalization after Cold War provided two public goods. One is a democratization, the other is a marketization, right? And these two things reduce a lot of conflicts, increased or nurtured a lot of international cooperation. But now the counter-globalization means there's a less international cooperation and more international conflicts.
Down here in the front.
Thank you. I'm very sad to show I'm visiting Fulbright Scholar at the MIT Security Study Group. You ended by saying we thought a Cold War, then better or worse. Just want to rephrase that a little bit and say, if not a Cold War, will there be a hot war? Can you say something about the risk of war between the United States and China? And especially, you haven't spent much on nuclear weapons, but how do you see the role of nuclear weapons in this fight? Thank you.
Okay. Well, if a Cold War is here, the post-Cold War is here. Now we're moving in that direction, we are here. So my view is that we can never reach the Cold War. That means the coming order is less stable than the post-Cold War order, but much better than the Cold War. The Cold War have let's take one reference as a judgment for judgment. During the World War I and World War II, the war cost 10 millions of casualty, right? After the Cold War, after the two wars, and the Cold War, each war cost how much? It's called millions of the casualty. After the Cold War, and there's a still proxy war, but the cost in most cases and less than 100,000 casualty. So in the now we are going to have suddenly we'll have the situation change, and the war in Ukraine just 1 year has already cost 200,000 casualties. It's certainly bad than the post-Cold War, but much better than the proxy war during the Cold War cost a casualty of more than a million, right? Million or 10 millions of the casualties. So here I have a very typical Chinese history to illustrate the differences. We all know that in China, we have a very important historical period, Spring Autumn, and the Warring States. And during all of the historians, both Chinese historians and the international historians agree that these two periods are different in character, not the same. In these two periods, all major powers of competition, but the goal of the competition and the way of the competition are different. First, in the spring and the autumn, the competition among major powers for hegemony, for dominating position, and they will force the other countries to accept their leadership through war. So each war and only cost 100 deaths or 1,000, and very rare over 10,000. But then when coming to the warring state period, the war changed. The purpose is not for hegemon position or hegemony for what? It's for annexation, annex other countries, totally destroy that country and make that country their part of their own. And so the casualty, the casualty of the war is increased to 10万 means 100 million, right? 100,000. And the war between Zhao and Qin, two states, and just the war over 200,000. So you see, the scale of the casualty of the war is can be used as a pragmatic reference to judge the character of the major powers competition.
I think we are nearing the end of the time, and I actually wanted to ask you one other question that has not come up yet, but it dovetails with what you've talked about. And that's, of course, the very dangerous question of Taiwan.
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean, at least commonly, people think that's the most obvious flashpoint. And the question is, how does that fit into your distinction between rivalry over natural phenomena and the cyber world?
Okay.
Think about it, right? Here we have, first of all, there's an ideological clash here. The American view that the Taiwanese people should be allowed to govern themselves, and the Chinese view that that doesn't matter, that Taiwan belongs to China and is a core interest and eventually must be reunited.
Yes.
It affects the strategic balance in Asia in a variety of ways. And there's, of course, a cyber dimension to this, given the importance of the Taiwanese chip industry. So even if this is a cyber competition, that doesn't eliminate Taiwan as a very important potential flashpoint as well. So solve that one for us.
Okay, a very hard neck to crack. And actually, Taiwan issue, I think most of the Chinese participants here, you may know that I made apologize publicly in newspaper and for the misprediction, and there will be war across the Taiwan Strait in 2008, and said I'm wrong. And since 2008, now it's already 15 years, and from then on, my prediction never wrong. Always proved that history. Since then, I said there's no there's no danger of war at Taiwan Strait. Okay, and so currently, what happened? And you may notice that after the party congress, and okay, there's a misunderstanding about the situation in Taiwan. And I just visited the Helsinki. There, people worry about it. China is going to take over Taiwan by military force, but no later by 2027. I guess this idea may be very popular here because Blinken said that, right? That's what Blinken said very recently. And actually, if you read the situation in China, you find that the official statement in China after the party congress and the situation totally different. And the 20th Party Congress report clearly stated peaceful reunification is the best approach for achieving national interests. It's also the most desirable and beneficial approach for China. So the interpretation is very clear. Why we replace the most beneficial and desirable way with a less beneficial and less desirable approach to solve the problem? First. Second, and very recently, we use the term, it's called advance the process of reunification. Just advance the process didn't mean that we're going to achieve the goal within the limited time. So by now, there's no timetable for the reunification. And third, I will say that, and why China should consider this very carefully and curiously. The war in Ukraine and tells everyone, not only Chinese, and also the foreigners, is that possible? You can win a war within few weeks? And Bush administration and said that we win the war in the Afghanistan. Just in a few weeks, we did it to announce the victory. Then the war lasted for 20 years. The Soviet Union sent the troops to Afghanistan, last for 10 years. And at the beginning, people said, Russian troops can win the war within 2 weeks. How about now? And even the policymakers in Kremlin don't know how long it will last. 3 years, 4 years, 10 years, no one knows. And so, and when no one knows how long the war will last, how can you make the decision to go to the war? And what the Paul and Bauer was his full name, and Colin Pauling, and he has a principle, and get in, get to win, and get out. If you cannot get out, you'll be occupied with that for decades. Can you make a decision to go to the war? So also, I think from both the political concern and the practical concern, I fully trust Chinese government statement. We prefer peaceful reunification.
I think almost everyone, if not everyone in the room, hopes that this prediction turns out to be more accurate than the earlier prediction as well. Mark, yeah, we're okay. Do you want to close? So we are not out of issues. I know we're not out of questions, but we are out of time. Please join me in thanking Xuetong for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.